College football is winding down, which means the NFL Combine, Pro Days, and ultimately the NFL Draft will be here before you know it. And Benjamin Robinson, who runs grindingthemocks.com, is here to unveil his first set of mock drafts for the 2026 NFL Draft. And before we do that, Benjamin, how have you been? I feel like I haven't seen you face to face in quite a while.
Well, life is good. No, I during draft season, I feel like I come out of the ground and people are like, "Where you been?" I'm like, "I've just been like underground, just like working on stuff." But I mostly found that the preseason stuff people just don't care very much about. They really start caring about stuff now, and so it allows me to go into that underground lair, that underground lab, and work on stuff, and finally have some real oddness to goodness draft conversation. Some teams are already been talking, and their fans have already been talking about it for a while now. So now I feel like it's a good time to join the fray, especially as we're about to get this college football playoff season started.
That's cool. You can reference the Raiders so quickly, given
Oh,
just how much of turmoil they've been a part of. I know my Raider friends here in LA. They've been bringing that up since probably mid-September.
yeah, I have a close former colleague who's a big Raiders fan, and I mean, it's from the Oakland days, and
Mhm.
so for him, I think it's there was a lot of hope, and then it's dashed, but now it's hope season again.
Exactly, and coincides with a holiday stretch, which as it
Yes,
should. So yes, life is wonderful in that regard. So
it's a wonderful
absolutely, that makes
life.
sense.
It's a wonderful life.
Oh yeah, Brett, I see what you did there.
Thank you.
All right, so in case anyone is learning about your work for the first time, I don't know why it would be. You've been around for quite some time. We've been friends for several years now. But in case someone is learning about your work for the first time, what makes your mock draft process maybe different? And how is it different than, say, others who also aggregate mock drafts?
Sure. It's totally cool if people have never heard of me. But yeah, I'm really excited to share. So I've been doing this for a while, but basically, my mock draft process is I'm not looking at team player fits. In fact, I don't really care too much exactly where players go into in terms of the team. What I'm really interested in is from a data science perspective. What are the range of outcomes for players? What is the most likely outcome for where a player might be selected in the draft? And it might not sound very important, but in fact, we know based off of research published by myself and then, Pro Football Focus and many others that it actually really is important where players are drafted relative to their expectation. And so that's a lot of what I do. So I kind of take like what Nate Silver did to elections I do for the NFL draft. And so I think what makes my process a bit different than other aggregators' approach is that um, I'm all about the data, but I'm also all about a model-based and data science-based approach. Other places, I think they'll kind of just look at like what player is mocked the most to a specific pick number, or like some type of like very easily influenced average. And I think from my perspective, when I think about the draft and I look at the mock draft as data, I think about it from maybe only like a few perspectives. I think about when this mock draft was published, which is kind of a proxy for how good is the information that we have based on the players, on the teams, um, any type of information that we have external to that as well. And then I also really care about who's making those mock drafts. Like, should we be listening to, Joe Schmo, or should we be listening to Dane Brugler? And the answer is we want to include both of their opinions. We want to weight up Dane Brugler's smart leadership opinion and weight down Joe Schmo because they're usually a follower, or they're lagging on information, or they really are just doing it, throwing darts. And so we want to have their opinion, but we want to weigh it down so that it's a part of our overall process, but it's not something that we think of really highly when we're thinking about how to slot these players. So I think that's a little bit of what makes my stuff higher quality is that all the unspoken assumptions that some of these aggregators will leave out, I bake in, and I try to use that data science approach, that data first approach to figure out how to point draft fans in the right direction when it comes to thinking about how we evaluate these players for the draft.
You bring up something important that I really never considered, but I think should be a part of this conversation, and that is that it is certainly something where you have more influencers, you have more folks who just want to get their name out there, and they do it by creating mocks. But at the same time, it's hard for those people and for us to know if they are being influenced by other folks, whether it's the friends around them, other people in the business, experts, whomever. And I'm curious what your process is, and if it's something you've noticed in the many years you've done this, that with more people perhaps succumbing to groupthink, that it
Yeah.
could be impacting what the overall final result is.
I think it does to a certain extent. I will say that, we tend I upweight the mocks that are, published really close to the draft. And some of the best people, like I said, like a Dane Brugler, like Daniel Jeremiah, like a Lance Zierlein, they tend to publish their final mock drafts like right before the draft. And so for the most part, people don't really have a lot of time to like follow that leader because that leader's like right before the draft. Um, so for the most part, the stuff that's happening right now compared to stuff that's happening even in like a month, you're actually not weighting it that much higher. So it's still all baked into the overall numbers, but we tend to we're weighing down a lot of these guys. But yeah, there is a ton of groupthink. The wisdom of crowds, the value of it comes from, this idea of independent thought process. Like I bring my thought process because I view it based on the numbers. Someone else brings their thought process because they're based on scouting. Someone else is just, does it based off of information. And in theory, we're all bringing our independent perspectives. But in reality and in practice, that's very naive to think that everybody is just completely in their own cave, thinking just their specific way, and therefore we have this perfect averaging that we can do. And that's why you need the model-based approach to account for, hey, like this person, like we can look back and see that their predictions are biased in this way. Um, I don't have a way of creating a specific metric around like, are you a follower? Are you a leader? That probably could be done. I don't think it necessarily adds too much to the process now that I've been doing this for so long and I know who are the names to trust and who are the names that, should just be listened to, but not too closely.
Well, speaking of caves, now that you are out of yours, let's go ahead and jump into your first aggregated board for the 2026 NFL Draft. Which player is the number one overall pick?
The number one overall projected pick right now in my expected draft position metric is Indiana quarterback Fernando Mendoza. Um, He's not somebody who came completely out of nowhere. In the preseason, there were some people who followed the draft who were really like calling him a big sleeper, and they were really right. Um, People like, Nate Tice from Yahoo and Corey Kinnan from Daft on Draft were really big about Mendoza coming from Cal and the promise that playing in Indiana's system would bring, and they were right. So he's the number one overall Heisman Trophy winning kind of guy that we've seen come through the draft process a lot over the last like 5 years that I've been doing this, where we're very used to seeing kind of 1 year wonders translate into high draft picks. When it comes to when it comes to mind about thinking who he kind of reminds me of, it's gonna be it's gonna sound a little hot take, but like last year, Cam Ward was kind of in that vein,
Mhm.
where in the preseason, people were like, "Oh yeah, like I remember him from Washington State. He had a lot of buzz in the portal, right? Around was he going to go to FSU or Miami?" Um, but it took a while for him to really like solidify himself as the number one overall pick in my data. And so when I think about a player to comp him to, it's kind of a little more like a Joe Burrow. So I have to think between like a Joe Burrow. By the time it was December, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, he's the guy." And then he went on this big run, won the national championship. I kind of think about him, and if Joe Burrow was like a little more like Cam Ward in the preseason process, and then a little bit more like Joe Burrow during the season process, then that's how I would think about Fernando Mendoza. So really deserving of potentially being a number one overall pick. But we'll talk a little bit more, but the overall quarterback class is a little more murky.
It certainly is. Yet at the same time, when you look at, say, Mendoza's statistics from this past season, more touchdowns than any other quarterback, big time throw rate, adjusted completion percentage from PFF. They also have him grading better than some of the other quarterbacks that may very well be a part of this class, like Oregon's Dante Moore, Alabama's Ty Simpson. But you mentioned Cam Ward, and I'm curious how Mendoza compares with other number one overall quarterbacks over the last few years.
Well, over the last few years, like I mentioned, Cam Ward last year, it took a little bit of time for him to kind of truly overtake Shador Sanders as like, yeah, this is the guy. Um, you know, he didn't play in his bowl game. Miami didn't was not a strong overall team like last year, unlike them, in the playoffs right now they are this year. Um, and then you think about, the year before, with, like your Caleb Williams, who was the number one pick the whole way. Drake May, who was, a top five prospect almost the whole way. Jaden Daniels, who kind of came a little bit out of nowhere, but didn't shoot up to being the top prospect. Um, I think Mendoza definitely is, at or around the Cam Wards, but he's not in the same group as Jaden Daniels, as Drake May, or Caleb Williams. I'm not even sure how evaluators think of him even compared to like the JJ McCarthy's of the world. Um, definitely I think the numbers will like him a lot more, and I think he'll get drafted higher. But there's always these hypothetical discussions of if he was in that class, where would he slot? And I find most of those to be pretty useless. But at the end of the day, I think, Mendoza is really exciting. I'm really excited to watch him continue to play some of these high level opponents in the playoff and further solidify himself as, yeah, this is a guy who's really competitive, really smart. I think you'll hear a lot of comps to like a Justin Herbert, um, where, we don't know if he's like an alpha, but he's kind of soft spoken, but people really like him and he's talented and like he's just not your like dog like kind of player. Like I think his a little bit of his mentality will be compared to more of like a Justin Herbert, or like I think you'll hear a lot of Jared Goff comparisons. But those are all good comparisons to have.
Once you and I devise a metric for quantifying that
Yeah.
dog in him, then I feel like we've really got something we can run with.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, let me ask you this about Mendoza. If Indiana wins the national championship and assuming Mendoza's healthy all the way to April, is it a slam dunk foregone conclusion he goes number one overall?
Um, I think not necessarily. I do think that there'll be a lot dependent on, who actually stays in the class. Um, Dante Moore, I think, will come out, but it's not I think 100% certainty. Like earlier in the season, you were hearing like Todd McShay, formerly of ESPN, say that he had 100% like, Dante Moore's parents want him to go back for another year at Oregon. Not certain that's the case anymore, but it's not 100% that he's gonna be in the class. Um, and then Ty Simpson, he had a really good year, but he struggled down the stretch. And when we talk about the playoff later, he'll be somebody who I think this playoff actually can be meaningful for. Um, but I think there's a good chance, very, very good chance, that Mendoza is the number one guy at the end of this process. But I think it will depend on who else is in the class. Um, if those other guys decide to stay in the class, stay in the same school, then I think, yeah, like it really, really ups his chances. But I'm not looking at any markets right now to take away more than I think they should. But I think Mendoza is very deserving of being the number one overall pick, and I think that if I had to pick one guy, yeah, I would pick him right now. I've probably been picking him for the last couple months anyway because I just think he's been the best throughout the season, and like I said, I look forward to seeing more from him in the playoff, just so he can solidify that. And we won't have to talk about this too much, but Dante Moore's skill set is really enticing, and so I think it's going to be either one of the two. Um, it'll be really interesting to see how the season ends and see which teams are up there, and then kind of what we think will happen in terms of is that team going to stick with that number one overall pick and take a Mendoza. Or is it going to be them trading out to some other team? But I do think Mendoza will probably be the number one overall pick. But, famous last words.
After Mendoza, who is in your top five?
The other players in my top five include two Ohio State defenders, Dante Moore and Ruben Bain, the edge rusher from Miami. So the two Ohio State defenders coming in at number two is linebacker Arvell Reese. Linebacker. Um, so when I see a linebacker, an off-ball linebacker in the top five of my rankings, I ask a lot of questions. Um, and I think something that's happening in scouting and in the draft is everyone's looking for that next player. And right now, that next player is who is going to be like a Micah Parsons character, who in college, they were really athletic. They played linebacker, but we've seen in like little sparks that they can maybe rush the passer. Last year, we had two players in the draft that were like that. Georgia linebacker Jalen Walker, who went to the Atlanta Falcons, and Alabama um, linebacker, man, why am I blanking on his name? Jahad Campbell, who went to
Yeah.
the Eagles. And so both of them were hyped as, wow, like very athletic, really great linebackers. Oh man, we see him pass rush, and oh man, like he could be a guy who could convert into a full-time edge rusher. And so that's a little bit of what I think I'm seeing with Arvell Reese. He's a really good off-ball linebacker. Um, but I think there's some people who are projecting him to be like something more than he probably will be, where I think he'll be an off-ball linebacker who can also rush the passer maybe in like sub packages. I don't think that's necessarily the most valuable piece on a defense that you would want to draft in the top five, but the talent is there. And so he's one of the most like surprising players in the class to me because, he really came as a linebacker out of nowhere really to start the season. No one was talking about him, unlike his teammate Caleb Downs, who's my fifth overall player, who's been hyped as, one of the top five players in this class the whole time. And then otherwise, I mentioned Ruben Bain, the edge rusher from Miami, who's had a really fantastic season. Um, Lately, there has been some discussion that some teams don't really see him as a true edge rusher because of his measurables. So I think you'll see him at the combine, and there'll be a lot of discussion about what he can do. Like some people think he's more of an inside pass rusher, but no one can deny that he was really excellent at Miami this year. Um, it's the interesting thing about the measurables is that the colleges tend to overinflate players' measurables because everyone wants to be like, oh man, like there's a 6'6", 280 pound guy or 260-pound guy coming off the bus, and then when you meet them, you're like, oh man, it's really more of a 6'3". Um, but yeah, he's
Tale as old as
listed.
time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it'll be really, I think the combine process is going to be really important for him. But he is another player who I think in the playoff can shut a lot of people up with his play. And so I'm really excited to see him go against, a really good offensive line in Texas A&M. Like we'll talk about later. I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis here, but there are players who I think the playoff matters, and I think Ruben Bain is one of them because of this discussion about his measurables and whether that translates to the NFL. But in college, he's been all you can ask for and more. Was like a top 10 player in the beginning of the cycle and now has pushed himself into top five consideration. But then I'm hearing that from like Dane Brugler's of the world that there's some teams that think of him as a day two guy. I don't know what to do with that, but right now he's in the top five.
Funny how that works. It is certainly something where we could see a lot of variance, especially as we record this on December 19th. And I'm curious when it comes to your process and what you've seen over the last several years, if say there is even more variance to come, not just when it comes to the top five, but the overall first round.
Yeah, so last year, about a month, I would say earlier this year, in January, when players were deciding about whether or not they should declare, I wrote a piece on my Substack, so it's grindingthemocks.substack.com, about Quinn Ewers, who was deciding that he was going to enter the draft. And it's kind of ironic because he's going to be starting for Miami this week. But at the time, I was saying, okay, at around this period where players have to make decisions, what does the data say about where your expected draft position is now and when we go to the draft? And so I looked back at about like 700 different prospects going back the last about 4 years or so, and we learned a couple things. Um, about half of them are going to fall from where they are right now. So, and part of that is that there's more room to fall down than there is to rise up for a lot of these guys. And then about like 35% of those guys will like kind of stay in their projected round. So like they just are who we are, and we feel really good about that evaluation. And then the rest, so about, 20% of guys, um, they're gonna rise. So in reality, and you fall by like 2 rounds. And when you rise by like a round and a half on average. And so there is a lot of uncertainty for players outside of the first round. Usually when we get to draft time, I have about 27 of the 26, 27 of the top 32 in my top 32. And I'd say about right now, it's probably closer to like 20. There are just some guys who are like first round locks, and there's other guys who end up, you know, they end up either going back to school because, we're in transfer portal season right now, or they end up being more like day two players than day one players because the great thing about this time is that most of the tape, it's in the barn. We know from the evaluation place, teams are finalizing their evaluations. Everyone's had opportunity to watch the top guys. It's a lot easier to delineate the top guys. So right now, there's still a lot of room. But for the most part, I'd say we know a little bit more about players right now than most people I think we do. But when we get to the draft, it's really just going to be around, like I said, like 26, 27 of my top 32. Most of the other ones will drop into that second round. There have been some times in the past where some of those guys have gone even in the third round, which is very surprising. But but yeah, we should feel like semi-comfortable about that now. But like I said, on average for everybody else, most players are falling, or not most, but like 45% of the players are falling by about 2 rounds on average in terms of mean absolute error on the pick based on expectation. If you're a riser, good for you. You're like a little bit of a minority there. You're probably going up by a round and a half, so like 1 to 2 rounds. And then if you're steady, you're like kind of in that 35% crowd, and you're probably going around 10 picks above or below where you're going.
That's really interesting that falling a couple of rounds is perhaps more common than we give it
Yeah,
credit for, because I remember, the obvious 2025 draft prospect in Shedeur Sanders. Yes, the position of quarterback is unique, but falling that drastically, maybe it isn't. And that certainly wasn't the conversation or the
yeah.
narrative at the time.
Yeah, I haven't rerun those numbers using 2025 data. Um, Before that, in the 2025, pre-draft declaration time, quarterback was one of my better positions in terms of the mean absolute error. It was only about a 1 round mean absolute error change for like the 45 players in my sample for quarterback. Um, but but yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, so Shador is going to inflate those numbers a lot, especially on an absolute, average absolute error basis. So. But yeah, no, last year was so surprising. I think, even my public model, so my public model, the draft stock model on my website had him in the like Pittsburgh Steelers range. Excuse me, my projection model that I use as the basis to sell data to teams had him in like the early second round. And so I was like, oh, like that's kind of interesting. And I was like, okay, maybe he's like a day two guy. Great. I have that. I can be like, ooh, look at my model. Look at that insight. No one
Mhm.
saw that. And instead, it's like, yeah, even that was too rosy. I don't think anybody saw that coming. Um, and so yeah, it's definitely a hard one, but everyone takes the L on that one. Kind of similar to like um, you know, the Tennessee Titans took um Malik. I keep on forgetting his name, but like, that was the last time where I think everyone got, really, really over their skis about a player
Right.
was when the Titans took Malik Willis, and he was
Mhm.
thought to be a first round player, and in reality, he ended up going like in the third round. So these things happen, but on average, we should expect the quarterbacks to fall about a round overall between now and the draft, but there are always exceptions.
Anyone else in your first round who you find particularly surprising as far as where they landed?
No, it's really Arvell Reese for me. Like I said, like I just I'm so surprised by the linebacker going that high. Um, the last time we were having that type of conversation, it wasn't at a top five sort of deal. It's like definitely like should we take a linebacker in the top 10? Parsons, um, he didn't play his junior year, and he still went, like outside the top 10, I believe, to the Cowboys. Um, you talk about like Roquan Smith, like there's just so many premium positions the NFL tends to draft over these guys. But if Arvell Reese is going to be a top five player on people's big boards, that usually means that they're going in the top five in the draft. Um, marking, like barring any kind of additional quarterbacks that wind up. But I'm seeing Mendoza up there on the boards. I'm seeing Moore up there on the boards, and Reese is a common name. So I'm surprised just because the league tends to be pretty good about drafting these guys, these premium positions in the right spots. But you know, I we'll see what happens. But he's probably the player I'm most surprised by because I just in the preseason never heard of him. Hear about him, the drums are pounding, and people are just like, man, he's so good. And then I watched a little bit of the Big Ten championship game, and I was looking for him, and I was like, he's around, but I'm not sure I want to be drafting a top five pick on a player who's just around. Um, but yeah, he has great tape from the season. Really, really good player. And I don't want him in the top five. If I was drafting in the top five, I would take Downs over him as a safety. I mean, I probably wouldn't take Downs either, but that's besides the point.
For sure, for sure. So we've got a college football playoff coming up this weekend, actually later today, given that we're recording this on Friday. So we've talked about Indiana. We've talked about Ohio State. We've briefly talked about Dante Moore. What are you most excited to watch for these playoffs that do not involve the aforementioned schools?
I'm really interested in some of the draftable players who have an opportunity to really like show more than what they've shown during this regular season. I'm going to talk about three different guys, two of whom I've already briefly mentioned. One is Alabama's Ty Simpson. And during the season, he had a really good run. Alabama had a really good run in the like very like they stumbled a little bit against Florida State, but then they really, really they were on a tear. And then as the season kind of ended, you see like the Auburn game, for example, which is, the Iron Bowl, very prominent rivalry game. Didn't look like if you looked on the highlights, he looked good, but then in between those highlights, it was not good. Um, and so I think a rematch against Oklahoma offers an opportunity for him to say, hey, remember all that stuff? I can step up against this really good competition. So Ty Simpson, the quarterback from Alabama, is somebody who I think has a lot to gain by playing well in the playoffs, by showing that he can like turn around this stretch of bad play with some of the things that he's shown earlier in the season. So I'm really excited to see him. He's an interesting case because he's actually pretty old. He's like, I think 23. And this is his first year starting. So I think it's probably in his best interest to come out. But if he doesn't play well, then I don't know. It's probably a little bit of a toss up for him. Maybe he's the kind of guy who gets overhyped and ends up being a day two pick instead of a day one pick. The other two guys, one is Ruben Bain, who I mentioned before. Miami plays Texas A&M, really good offensive line, one of the, best edge rushers in the class this year. But like I said, there's all these questions, and so he can further erase some of those questions. If he plays well, maybe he's not an edge rusher, but maybe he's like some sort of like really, really great interior pass rusher. That's a valuable skill, and that's a valuable position, for teams to take a chance on as well, given his athleticism and given how good he's been in terms of like the pressures and the win rates. And then the last player is also another Alabama player. It's offensive lineman Caden Proctor. So he's a big boy. In fact, you might have noticed this season he even got split out a couple times and caught some passes
Ah,
and
yes, I
rumbled and did his
remember.
thing.
Yep.
We love some big guy touchdowns. Um, but he's been one of the biggest fallers in terms of my data since the start of the process. And I think it's been that unevenness in play. Um, and so I think for players who have questions about their overall film throughout the season, this additional tape, maybe hopefully more than one game for Proctor, could give him the opportunity to say, hey, like, look at me against R. Mason Thomas from Oklahoma. I can shut him down. Um, I think he compares in some ways as a player from a measurables perspective to J.C. Latham, was taken in the top of the draft by the Titans 2 years ago. But he was like a guy who was on the upswing and Proctor's on the downswing. And so he needs to have put together some good games to show that he can be consistent, and that he's a guy that scouts should be thinking of as a first rounder instead of a guy who's on the margins of the first round. And so for those types of players, for the Simpsons, for the Proctors and the Bains, um, you know, this playoff run can make or break their stock because it can show teams, hey, remember that uneven play? I can bring it up during those big games against high quality opponents.
Before I let you go, tell everyone where they can catch your work.
Oh man, thank you so much. So yeah, you can find my work in a couple of places. So one is, well, let's talk about a few places. One is you can find me on the socials. Grinding Mox is the X/Twitter handle. I'll be posting there quite a bit. The website is grindingthemox.com, and then you can find my writing on Substack at grindingthemox.substack.com. And so, as we go into the draft process, I'll probably update my numbers the next time, probably pre-combine, and then after the combine, and then leading up to the draft every like probably 2 weeks or so, you'll see a fresh new set of numbers from me, and we'll get to talk a bit more about the dynamics that are happening in the draft for this class. And then as we get into that draft period, the sweet, sweet sound of those picks getting made, and then looking at them compared to where we thought they would go, which is always the most fun part when my projections get it just right. It's nothing better.
Do you like the clock being shortened?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Okay. Fair
know,
enough.
we know it's like we know most of the time that they know like that they want to make the pick, but the NFL's making them extend it.
Hmm.
Like, like when you're like in your fantasy draft, like that's way too little time. But
Right.
like, imagine if you're like, I know I'm gonna take that guy number one overall, and they're like, actually, for the television, could you wait the full 15 minutes? Could you do it?
Just milk it. Yep.
Just milk it. And then you're like, and that is it is. Um, but yeah, like sometimes yes, other times no. But for the most part, I think the draft is pretty good television. And I'll be coming back as always.
We really need to get that hotel commercial in. So could you please
Yes.
milk it just a couple more minutes?
Yes. Um, of the draft broadcasts, I'm used to being an NFL Network guy, and then
Hmm.
I was like an ESPN guy. But I think that there's like a pretty good like more like alternate broadcast that Lance Zierlein and some others do that ends up being pretty good. It's just not a primetime television broadcast. So
Right.
it's a little bit less of the let me tell you the story about this player and their background and like those kinds of personal stories and a little bit more about the tape. So if you like the type of stuff that I think it's called the Command Center, that's the one you want. It's
But
like the prime vision of NFL draft stuff. If that's
right,
that,
yes.
yeah.
If we don't make this all about Sam Schwartzstein at some point today, then what are we
Oh,
doing?
what are we doing?
Exactly. Benjamin Robinson of Grinding the Mocks, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem, and I definitely want to do this again as the process goes on.